because we think our life is filled with comfort and ease. If they're filled with comfort and ease, then God's blessing benefits of trials. And so if the blessings are through the trials, I know this is kind of hard to say and hard to hear, but wouldn't it be better then to have trials if the blessings come through the trials than to not have them? And I know every single one of us are sitting back going, nope, I don't think so. But I think deep down inside, we know that that's true. The other thing we have to remember with this is life is a vapor, as I said before. It's a vapor compared to eternity. Yet we tend to look at life as this is all there is. This is everything there is, but that's not really true. Eternity is everything. This life is a vapor, and in a large degree, it's a testing ground, isn't it? It's a time where we can have the opportunity to be faithful to God. What are we going to do? What's our attitude going to be when the trial hits? So, having said that, Satan answered the Lord, verse 9, and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And so Satan is saying, the only reason he serves you is because you've blessed him. You've made his life comfortable. You've given him a lot of good things, a good family, and so forth. But you take that away, you test him through this trial, and he's going to fail the test. He's going to curse you to your... Can you see how this trial is a test that's going on? Again, I think that the way people make a mistake is they get the wrong picture of God's character through this and think that he's just up there like playing with little dolls, so to speak. Well, let's try and get him, or let's see what would happen if you give him. Again, God knows what's going to happen in the end, and God's intention, as we're going to see, is blessings in Job's life through this, just like blessings end up coming to our lives when we go through those testings and those times of trial. And so what ends up happening is Satan is able to wreak havoc, and Job loses all of his possessions because they're stolen away. And then his son's house is crushed with the rest of the children in it. So all of his children end up dying. So he's lost his financial possessions. He's incurred emotional loss. And when word came to Job, verse 20, we read his reaction. In Job 1:20, it says, "Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" The test has come, and Job has passed the test. He didn't curse God to his face. And notice what he did. He's thankful to the Lord for what he had given him. Thankful for the years maybe that he did have with his children. Thankful for the blessings that he did have. But he recognizes, God gave that to me. I know God has taken it away from me. May God's name be blessed. And he worshiped the Lord. That's the kind of attitude we see. The kind of attitude when a trial hits, what do? You know, what are we to do? Do we go, God, why are you doing this to me? Or God, why would you allow this to happen to me? Or rather, God, what is it that you want me to learn from this? And turn to him, fall to him, as opposed to falling away from him. And so that's not the end of it. That's bad, but that's not the end of it. It says in verse 22, "In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong." And then we look at chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. In other words, Satan, he passed the test. You said he would curse me to my face, but he has passed the test. So Satan, verse 4, answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. So he's lost his wealth, right? All of his possessions. He's lost his family, and now he's lost his health. Can you see how those kind of can mirror some of the trials that we go through, some of the biggest trials we go through when we run into financial hardship, or when we run into an emotional loss because we've lost a loved one, or when we run into illness? You can see where all three of these kind of fall into that, can't they? So really a trial is more than just being persecuted because of your faith. It can be any hardship that you're going through. Now, we can see what's going on behind the scenes in this particular case, that it's actually a test from God that Satan has been able to work out with God's permission to do that. Notice, though, how it continues to get worse in verse 9. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, how many of you think that his wife is being a helpmate at this point? It's not really a help, is it? You know, he's lost everything, and now his wife is saying, why don't you just do what Satan says you'll do and curse God to his face? Now, I don't know, maybe there's two sides to this. I mean, she's lost her children too. She's lost all of her wealth as well. Maybe she's just wanting Job to put an end to it. You know, I hate to see you in all of this suffering, all the boils and the pain and so forth. And who knows, maybe it's out of a heart of compassion for him. I don't know. What I see in it is more of a tool in the enemy's hands. You know, let's see if we can get Job to curse God. And notice what Job says in verse 10. He said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Are we just fair weather believers? Are we only going to hang around while good things are happening? Or are we going to stick it out when the difficulty comes? Shall we only accept good from God and not accept adversity? What should our attitude be in the times when trials hit? Trust, isn't it? Trusting in God, putting our trust in him. We know that he is the one that is in control. He is the one that can carry us through these things. So with all of this, I found it really interesting in Job 23:10. This is what Job said. And by the way, this got worse. So it's not just he lost his possessions and his family and his health, but he also had 3 comforters that came and sought to make things better. And all they did was say, you know, if you weren't such a sinner, this wouldn't have happened to you, which wasn't true, we find out in the end, that his friends, so-called, were wrong. But notice what he says in Job 23:10. He says, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Isn't that neat? Because it's the same idea as the refining process. He's tested me. He's put me through this. And when he's tested me, I shall come forth as gold. There's going to be that refining process. So again, the purpose of the trials is to burn away the impurities, to make us more than what we would naturally be if the trials had never come. And so the benefit that comes from them as well. Finally, to wrap up the illustration, example, of Job, in James chapter 5, James writes in 5:10 and 11, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. So it speaks of Job's perseverance. It speaks of his patience. But did you catch that? The end intended by the Lord. The Lord wasn't just acting haphazardly or capriciously. It's like, oh, why don't you see what Job will do if you test him? But God had an intended end for his life, to bless him. When you get to the end of the book of Job, you see that he received double than what he had. He received twice as many of the animals. He, had like 500 camels in the beginning in chapter 1, and he had 1,000 camels at the end in the last chapter. He received back, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He received back an additional 7 sons and 3 daughters. It also says that he lived an additional 140 years, which some think that if everything is doubling in that maybe he was 70 years old when this all happened and he was given another 140 years. If that's the case, it puts him at 210 years old, which would date the book of Job, possibly one of the reasons to date the book of Job, back to the days of the patriarchs when Abraham and so forth lived to be much older than they did after that. There's a number of reasons to look at dating this book, which would put this book as one of the oldest books in the Bible then, back in the days of the patriarchs. You know, when I look at that and I see the doubling of things, like I mentioned, he had 500 camels, then he ended up with 1,000 camels. He ended up living an additional 140 years. And I think about the kids, and it's like, you know, he only got back the same amount of kids. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and they died, and then he got 7 more sons and 3 daughters. But in reality, they were doubled, weren't they? Because again, this life is like a vapor. When you get to eternity, how many sons does he have? He's got 14. You know, he's got 6 daughters. And so if you look at it that way, my point being in James 5, the intended end of the Lord. The intended end was to bless Job, was to bless him through the fiery trial, the difficulty that he went through. And I want to suggest to us as well, is that's what he's got in mind with us. When he allows us to go through the things that happens, it's not just, well, you live in a fallen world, that's what's happening to you. There's a plan that he's got, that he's going to bring good out of whatever tragedy might come into our life. Whatever he might allow to come into us, there's going to be good that comes forth from it. As it says at the end of James 5, that God is very compassionate and merciful. So he knows that these hardships of life are going to benefit us. Let's look at one more example as we're back here in the Old Testament. Let's go to Genesis 22, and we're going to look at Abraham. As we're talking about what kind of attitude to have in the trials. Genesis chapter 22, and notice what it says. Verse 1, now it came to pass after these things, notice, that God tested Abraham. Remember, we're talking about trials. And trials, the word, looking back in the New Testament, can be translated temptation. It can be translated test or testing. And so this is a big trial that's coming upon Abraham. And notice that God is the one that is testing Abraham. It came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now this had to have been the biggest trial that ever hit Abraham, because Isaac was, as it says here, it was the son that he loved. By the way, this is the first time in the Bible the word love is used, and it's the love of a father for his son. Abraham's love for Isaac. And do you notice how God said to take now your son, your only son? It's interesting to note that Abraham had Ishmael at this time, but God didn't acknowledge Ishmael, did he? He didn't acknowledge the work of the flesh between Abraham and Hagar, but he acknowledges the son of promise, Isaac, between Abraham and Sarah, the one that was promised by God, the work of the Spirit, if you will. And so he gives Abraham this test to take Isaac and offer him up. Now you have to realize the backstory in this, that God has promised that Abraham is going to be a great nation. In other words, there's going to be multitudes of people that are going to come through Abraham. And he said specifically, in Isaac your seed shall be called. In other words, this great nation is going to come through Isaac, and Isaac doesn't have any children yet. And yet God is telling Abraham to go offer up Isaac. And so notice what Abraham does. And what do you think he would do? What would we do if we were put in that situation? And what is he asking Abraham to do? He's asking Abraham to give up that which you love the most. To give up that which you love the most. I watched a movie once on the life of Abraham. It was a really bad movie, to be honest with you. And when it came to this scene, it had Abraham shaking his fist at God in the heavens. Why, God? Why, God? You know, maybe that's how a lot of people would act, but look at the attitude, and that's what we're looking at. Look at the attitude of Abraham in verse 3. It says, so Abraham rose early in the morning. And notice how many times the word and is used. Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. It's like there's no hesitation in Abraham at all. God said to do it. This is what I'm doing. I'm going to go forth with exactly what God said to do. And so he does. He takes Isaac, he takes the servants with him. He goes to the land of Moriah, to the hill, a 3 days journey, which God had led him to. And he takes Isaac up there and he binds him. And he raises up the knife to take his life. And notice in verse 11, it says, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Remember again, it was a test. It was a test, and Abraham passed the test. He not only passed the test, but he passed it with a great attitude. Again, coming back to what attitude should we have? We should trust God. And he trusted God in this. And to Abraham, what was he thinking? What was he thinking when God is saying, you're going to take Isaac, you're going to offer him as a burnt offering, yet I know I already told you that you're going to be a great nation and it's going to be through Isaac. I think we can see what he's thinking when we look at Hebrews chapter 11, where it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Notice, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. What's going through Abraham's mind? Well, he said that I'm going to be a great nation through Isaac. Isaac doesn't have any kids. He wants me to take Isaac's life. 2 and 2, the only way I get 4 out of this is God's planning on raising him up from the dead, That is tremendous faith, okay? That is some serious faith that he has in God. So the attitude that he had, trust God. The attitude of Job, trust God. Our attitude when trials hit, I don't know why this is happening, but I'm going to trust God in it. I'm going to trust God because I know he has his hand upon me. And he's not, if you notice in the story of Job, Satan couldn't do anything to him unless God allowed it. Did you recognize that? Okay. And again, we look at that, and I think in our minds sometimes, you guys, we think, well, wait a minute, though. I mean, these are bad things, and why would God allow that? Again, we tend to look at bad things as, oh, this is outside of what God would want for us. What God would want for us is comfort, and he would want those things that feel good and are blessings. But what we find is the benefits that come from the trials we're in vastly outweigh the benefits of not having the trials, of having all of the comfort. It's better actually to be, well, what would you rather have? A dirty, shoddy piece of gold or a shiny piece of gold that's been refined in the fire? And that's what takes place again in our lives, that refining process when we go through the difficulties. So let's talk a little bit about what the benefits of the trials are. In James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, it says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. The word trials, it can be and is translated in various translations as temptations or as troubles. And so again, the context is going to define which word that the translator would use. Notice again, he says, when you fall into various trials, there's a lot of different kinds of hardships that we fall into. Notice the attitude that's to be had. My brethren, count it all joy. Count it all joy. I'm going to say not for the trial, but what's produced out of the trial. And that's what I think we see in these verses right here. Notice, count it all joy when you fall into these various trials. Why? Well, knowing that the testing of your faith, it produces something. When you're going through the fire and the heat's turned up, it's producing something. And what it's producing here is patience. It's a steadfast endurance. It's a dependency upon God, a dependency we wouldn't have if everything was going okay. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, to be whole, to lack nothing. And when we learn, I think, to depend upon God, that's when we get to the place where we're becoming complete. When we're living independent of Him, and I'm going to do it my own way, and stumble and fall, it's when we learn to depend on Him and look to Him for His guidance. So the benefits that we see is that it produces patience in us that leads to completeness. Let's look at another one in Romans chapter 5. When Paul is talking about the blessings of salvation, and we're rejoicing in that, he says, and not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. The word tribulations is also translated as afflictions or sufferings or trials. And so what is the attitude? It's that we glory, and that word can be translated rejoice. It's like James 1. We rejoice in these tribulations, in these sufferings, in these trials. Again, why? Notice, knowing that it's producing something. These tribulations are producing perseverance. The word perseverance is the same Greek word that's translated patience in James 1. Same thing's being produced here, this steadfast endurance, this perseverance, this dependency upon God. And perseverance produces character, a character in us. Again, the refining of us into pure gold. Character, they say, is who you are when nobody's looking. I'm not trying to act a certain way. I'm behind closed doors. Nobody else is looking. And character is who I am at that point. Through the trials, it's producing in us a perseverance, a patience, a dependency upon the Lord. And that is also producing, molding that character and character hope. So the attitude here is rejoicing. It's being hopeful. The benefit is the perseverance and also the character. How about another one? 2 Corinthians 4:17. Paul writes, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Again, we're talking about the benefits of trials. He says our light affliction. By the way, the word affliction in the Greek, the same word translated tribulation in the previous verse in Romans chapter 5. We glory in tribulations, same word that's being used here. He says our light affliction, and he's talking about the trials. He's talking about the suffering. And you know what Paul went through. 2 Corinthians 11, how he's beaten in various ways, how he's on the run from so many people that wanted to kill him. I mean, his life was a constant battle from the point that he became a Christian until the point that he was beheaded. And he can refer to that as light affliction. Guys, if Paul can refer to his sufferings as light affliction, can we do any less in the things that happen to us? He says our light affliction, light compared to what? Right, be the eternal weight of glory, a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. These are light in comparison to that. And notice he says, which is but for a moment. I mean, this was Paul's Christian life, was affliction, but compared to eternity, again, it's a vapor, right? It's but for a moment. If something happened that's gonna affect you the rest of your life, it's so small in comparison to eternity. You know, and so we can have a trial, but you don't realize this is going to be this way the rest of my life. Again, it's so small in comparison to eternity, and that's the eternal perspective that we see in this verse. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, notice, it's working for us. Like the other verses, it's producing, knowing that it's producing perseverance, it's producing patience. It's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. The benefit is something eternal. It's glory in the eternal realm. Goes with Romans 8:18, where Paul said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Again, light affliction compared to this exceeding eternal weight of glory. These present sufferings, not even worthy to compare them with the glory that's going to be revealed. And so we've been looking at the attitude we should have in trials. We've been looking at the purpose of trials, how they refine us as gold is refined in a fire, and we see the benefit of them, what comes through the trials. And so with all of this, I think the main point that I want us to get from it is the fact that when bad things happen, number one, trust the Lord. Put your trust in him. Fall to him. Don't fall away from him. And just know that he has our best interests at heart. He knows what he's doing, and if we put our trust in him and hold on to him through these difficult times, he's going to create something in us that could never be created any other way, and that will ultimately bring him glory. And that's really what we're here to do, isn't it? We're here to glorify the Lord. Let's turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we'll look at Paul's life as an example as we start drawing this to a close. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul has just gone through a chapter about talking about the persecutions that he went through. And then he talked about in chapter 12, the abundance of the revelations that were given to him, speaking of himself in the third person. And then as we get to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning from verse 7, Paul writes, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." So again, as he's been talking about all of the blessings that have been given to him, the tremendous spiritual experiences that Paul had, when you think about it, I mean, Paul, the Lord actually spoke to Paul. I mean, when we read in the book of Acts, we see the red letter there where the Lord is speaking, the Lord Jesus is speaking to Paul, and he's been speaking in chapter 12 here about he knows a man that was caught up to the third heaven, and many feel that he was speaking like many of the rabbis would speak, speaking of himself in the third person as he's talking about that. And so because of these abundance of revelations, lest he should be exalted, in other words, lest he should be puffed up with pride and then become not usable by the Lord, he says, notice, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. Not a thorn in the flesh was forced upon me, or a thorn in the flesh was inflicted in me, but a thorn in the flesh was given to me, like a gift that you give to somebody else. This trial that was given to Paul. And what would this trial do? It would keep him from becoming proud, becoming unusable. How about that, huh? And what is the thorn? The only thing we really know about it for sure is he says it was a messenger of Satan to buffet him. And yet it's referred to as being given to him. Here's a gift. Like Job. Job, here's a gift. Satan's going to, like Jesus said to Peter, Satan is desired to, what? Sift you as wheat, to put you through the ringer. And a gift, as we look at it here, to go through. Why? Because it's going to protect Paul. It's going to protect him through this. Now, it wasn't pleasant, was it? Because as it says, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Whatever it was, what was the thorn in the flesh? And commentators, they speculate as to what this is. Some think that maybe it was just his guilty conscience because he had put Christians to death, and now he's the apostle Paul. Some think that it was some kind of oriental eye disease that he had that caused his eyes to run with pus, and he was just really difficult to look at, and yet he's trying to share the gospel with other people. In Galatians it says, see, with what large letters I've written to you. And he says to the Galatians, if it was possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. So some think that maybe this thorn in the flesh was physical, something with his eyes. It's just speculation as to what it was. All we know is that it's a messenger of Satan that was given to buffet him. And he says he pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from him, verse 9. And he said to me, that is, the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. It's like, Lord, I want this trial to go away. And he says, you know what? All you need is my grace. How about that? All you need is my favor. You don't need the trial to go away. You just need my favor, and you have my favor. Isn't that neat? I mean, God loves us. And again, Lord, help us to see the blessings that come through the trials. Because that's a picture, I think, a clear picture of what reality is. My grace is sufficient for you. Notice, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So Paul's response, again, as we're talking about the benefits, strength through this, and also the attitude, Paul says, therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities. Why? That the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So you see how he's pleaded with the Lord to take it away, but he recognizes, as the Lord speaks to him yet again, is that through your weakness, that's where you're going to be strong. It's kind of like what we read in James and Romans, isn't it? It's producing in you a perseverance. In your weakness of this trial, it's producing in you a patience that is going to bring you to a place of completion, where you can be not strong in your own strength, but that you're weak in your strength, now you'll be strong in his strength. Isn't that cool when you look at that? Alan Redpath says God works through the man who has been wiped clean and turned inside out, his life emptied before the Lord until he is hopelessly weak, that no flesh might glory in his presence. Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So in conclusion, trials refine us. Our attitude should be that of trusting in God through the trials. They have eternal benefits, and they make us more like Jesus. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time in your word as we look at the Christian in trials. And Lord, I pray for each of us that when the trials do come, not if, but when they come, Lord, that we would have the attitude that we see in Job, the attitude in Abraham. Lord, that you would give each one of us the strength, oh God, to not question you, to not say, what are you doing, but to simply say, Lord, what would you have me learn through this? Make me into the person you want me to be. Lord, I thank you that you love us so much that you allow these things to come into our lives. And Lord, I pray that our lives would give you glory. In Jesus' name, amen.